Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming along this afternoon. It is, for me, one of the most important sessions of World Travel Market this year, the debate on child protection. I wanted to start, actually, by thanking... Is there anybody here from Travel Trade Gazette? Well, I'm going to put this on video, because they deserve it. They have done us a most fantastic double-page spread on the issue of child protection. So, full marks to Travel Trade Gazette. It's very good to see the issue being headlined in that way in the travel media. We've got a large panel this afternoon. I'm slightly embarrassed by the number of people I've invited along, but the issue is a broad issue, and I wanted to make sure this afternoon that we had the chance to talk about the full range of child protection. Clearly, one of the issues that people worry about most is child sexual exploitation and trafficking, but we also need, I think, this afternoon to talk about the issue of child labour, about the safety of young people who are abroad on a gap year, and we also need to think about child abuse and neglect within outbound families. And I think we've got together here a panel of people who've got something very useful to say about those issues. The whole session is being videoed and will be on the net very shortly. I plan to write up a report of this event as well in terms of setting the agenda for the issues that this panel thinks the tourism industry should be addressing. Traditionally, this spot has been a debate, but you won't be surprised that we couldn't find anybody prepared to argue the case that the tourism industry was already doing enough for child protection. But I thought it would be useful to have a vote to see where the opinion is now. And the motion that we have before us is that this House believes that the tourism industry could do a good deal more to take responsibility for child protection and urges it to do so. Is there anybody who supports that motion? Is there anybody who objects to that motion? That's why we couldn't have a proper debate. That we couldn't have found somebody prepared to take that position. So what I'm going to try to do by interviewing this panel for you is to raise some of the issues. Then we're going to throw it open to the floor, and we'll come to some kind of conclusion perhaps at the end. Now, if I could just introduce the panel to you, we've got Bill Bell, who's here from, he's Head of Child Protection for Save the Children, over here. We have Willem Nijmeijer, who's the founder and CEO of Kiri Travel, an inbound operator in Southeast Asia. We then have Peter Watt, who is the National Services Director of the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. If I could just make a comment about what it's like to be English, it is worth reflecting upon the fact that we have a Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals and a National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, which is something which has worried me since I was a child. Elise is here from TUI Benelux. She was awarded the overall winner position in the Responsible Tourism Awards last year when she was at TUI Netherlands for the stunning work which they have done in raising the issue of child protection with their consumers, with their travellers. And I want her to talk about that shortly. And then we have Bharti Patel, who's here. She's the CEO of ECPAT UK, who many of you will know. It's a charity that focuses on the sexual exploitation of children. Then we have Amanda Reed, who's in uniform, although it doesn't show very much when you're sat down. Steel-toed boots, I understand. She's here from the UK Border Force, head of child protection, or responsible for child protection and their work at Heathrow. And on the extreme left, my extreme left here, we have Marcio Favilla, who's the Executive Director for Competitive External Relations and Partnerships from UNWTO. So, we have a very high-quality panel, and I know many of the people in the audience, and I'd just like to say that we have a very high-quality audience as well this afternoon. So I'm hopeful that we will have an interesting debate. But let's start by asking our panelists where they think we're at. And Bill, if I could start with you, could I ask you to sketch out the way Save the Children sees the range of issues where children are at risk in the holiday process?
Yeah. it might be helpful actually just to sort of place that within the broader context of child protection internationally. Because I think particularly for a UK audience, child protection is seen quite narrowly probably these days as about, we've seen cases very much in the media recently around sexual abuse and sexual exploitation. Globally, I think child protection is a much bigger issue affecting millions of children. It covers basically sort of three key areas, I suppose: abuse, which is sort of sexual and physical abuse of children; neglect, where children are not receiving proper care and therefore not receiving the proper kind of support they need to grow up; and exploitation, where literally they are being exploited, usually by an adult who's deriving some benefit from it, and so on. And the sort of issues that certainly Save the Children works on globally would include sexual and physical abuse. It's a growing understanding that this is a global issue. This is something that people don't want to talk about, but in fact is something that is becoming clear that it's in every country in the world. And again, we've seen what's been going on in the UK over the last few decades, recently in the media. But we know increasingly, we see the evidence that this is a problem in every country. Child labour, there are still over 100 million children at work across the world. Child trafficking is a key issue, child trafficking into the UK as well, child trafficking across other parts of the world. And an issue that's not often talked about, but is very important, is this issue of poor care, children not receiving proper care and so on. And we'll talk a little bit later about sort of orphanages and the problem that we see in orphanages around the world in terms of not offering good quality care to children. And neglect also includes separation from the family. So again, the tourism industry, I think, sometimes has an unintended effect of separating children from their family. Again, something we could talk about a little bit more. So globally, it's a very important issue. Millions of children are affected. Within the kind of various issues, obviously the tourism industry has certain kind of impacts on those broad issues of child protection. If I just pick up on perhaps three of them, one clearly is that the tourism industry facilitates access to children in a way that would be unacceptable here in the UK. In the UK, it's impossible to have contact with children without proper police check, without ensuring that you are supervised and so on. However, in many cases, the tourism industry enables people to have unrestricted open access to children, which clearly puts those children at risk. The industry, I think, also, again, with the best of intentions, but actually having unintended consequences, creates harm to children. An example of that would be around providing opportunities for people to volunteer into orphanages. Again, that can create problems of sexual abuse, it can create problems of poor care, and so on. And actually, I think in many cases around the world, fuels an orphanage industry, which we're not aware of because we think orphanages are an obviously good thing. They're not at all an obviously good thing. And in fact, encouraging volunteers to go into them simply fuels and drives the proliferation of orphanages, which is something that actually we're trying to close down around the world. And finally, I think, we've mentioned child labour. Clearly, children are in the tourism industry. They're in the labour market for, particularly in sort of resorts and in other venues and so on. That's clearly an issue as well. So a range of issues, I think, where the tourism industry has a very direct impact on children's protection and so on. The scale of that is extremely difficult to estimate, and that's a general problem for child protection around the world, because so much of it is criminal. Child trafficking, child labour, sexual abuse, they're all criminalised issues. So actually getting any sort of accurate data on those issues is very difficult. They're very sensitive issues. Sexual abuse is not something people, either children or adults, want to talk about. So it's very difficult to get them to report these problems. There's a lack of official data for these sorts of reasons and so on. So identifying really what is the scale of this is, I think, quite difficult for us. What we do know is that a large number of children experience real problems because of this, with quite significant long-term consequences for their development, their emotional development, their physical development, their intellectual development. These are all significant impacts and significant harms that they experience. You asked, just to finish off here, what might the tourism industry do? And I think there's obviously some very specific things we could talk about. And I just wanted to pick up sort of three general principles. One is, as we do as an organisation, we're a development NGO, everything we do, the key principle is do no harm. Do not do anything. Think very clearly about what you're doing and ensure that you do no harm. Good intentions are not good enough. Thinking you're doing well is not good enough. You have to think about, will this have a harmful impact, particularly on children, who are the most vulnerable, the most at risk, and in a sense the most innocent as well. Again, I'd say to the industry, think of the child and not just of the customer, the client. Think of the children that will be around your customers, your clients, and so on, and what will happen to those children. So think all the time of them. And think child safeguarding, which is what we do in the UK now as a matter of course. Every organisation now working with children is thinking consciously and explicitly about child safeguarding. How can they ensure the children they have some responsibility for are safe and protected? How can we think as an industry about creating an offer to your customers that is attractive but is also child safe? And how can we think about that in a very sort of conscious way and then act upon it? Because I think, again, there's a danger, for example, with codes of conduct, for example, that or something you sign up to, that you think, well, I've signed up to it, therefore I can forget about it. Well, no, this is about thinking about it and then acting consciously upon it. So I hope that provides a sort of overall picture.
That's very helpful, I think. Thank you very much indeed for that. Amanda, could we think about this from your perspective? Now, you're head of safeguarding at Heathrow. You're responsible for the coordination across that whole airport, all 5 terminals. How big an issue is it for you and your colleagues? How much of it do you see?
I think, protecting children is absolutely our priority. From April of this year, we've been doing safeguarding for many years, but of April this year, we have established expert safeguarding and trafficking teams at each terminal. And we have officers on duty on each shift to make sure that we speak and interact with any child that's arriving. Any child that's under 18 who's travelling on their own or with somebody other than the parent, then we will speak to them and make sure that the arrangements in place for them to come into the country, to be looked after, are adequate, and that there's no risks in place. I had a quick look. It's difficult to give stats. I've had a quick look at, we keep a safeguarding log in each terminal of any cases that we hold up. It might be just a quick call. It might be a quick call to family members here. It might be a call to colleges. It might be a call to social services. Whatever checks we do, we record them in this log. And I would suggest probably that there's, on average, at least 500 of those. That's coming through just Heathrow. That's not any other ports. And out of those, probably about 100 probably get taken to a further level.
Sorry, that's 500?
Hold-ups, just people that are stopped just to make further inquiries. It might be just...
How often? Over what period would that 500
well,
come?
You have no... Over the month, sorry, over a month.
Over a month.
Sorry, I didn't clarify that yet. Over a month. But as I say, we speak to any child that's arriving on their own or with somebody other than a parent to make sure everything's in place. So
Amanda, just to be sure that I've got this right, because I'm quite horrified by that figure. You're saying 500 interventions a month to check, of which 100 you would want to take further?
Yes. It may be something that we just want to make sure that it might be a private fostering arrangement. I think probably the best thing is if I actually illustrate it with a few cases, because I think, to put it into reality. Okay, a couple of cases. An adult and 2 minors claiming to be Korean nationals arrived from Brussels at Terminal 5. The adult said that the children were sisters and wanted to enter the UK to transit to Hong Kong. All 3 passports contained counterfeit biodata pages, so there were forgeries included in the documents. After further questioning, the adult passenger said they were actually all Vietnamese and had been trafficked by somebody in China. A baggage search revealed masses of contraceptives, suggesting a link to vice trade. The minors were then put into the care of social services. On the other side, we also, another case, we held up a 16-year-old girl who had come from Munich. She said she was just coming to see a girlfriend. She'd met an old school friend. But as with all checks, we made checks. The parents thought that she was just coming to see a girlfriend. But when we went to speak to the friends downstairs, the phone was actually answered by 2 different men. It turned out both had criminal records, and one was known to be extremely violent. One of the men admitted he had been in a relationship with the girl since she was 14. The passenger was obviously refused entry. We liaised with the parents, and they were obviously completely horrified with the arrangements. In a recent high-profile case, it's all over the press anyway. It's Jason Gandy. He's an American. He was a nude male masseuse who brought a young boy just before the Olympics to the UK. And he was intercepted by immigration officials at Terminal 4, and he's currently in the state penitentiary out there. And our liaison with the Americans found out that there was also a previous history of sexual abuse. So they're the kind of interceptions, just to give you a kind of illustration, a bit of a flavour about what we're doing. I mean, it might be things such as, even we'll hold, if there's teenage children, 16-year-olds that might be just coming on holiday on their own, boyfriend and girlfriend, but we'll make checks, and quite often the hotels won't accommodate them. We need to make sure the parents know about it. We really go to the nth degree to make sure we're fully satisfied and we discharge our safeguarding obligations.
Marty, I think you might be the only person in the room who's not looking shocked.
Oh. Not shocked, because we've seen the statistics, and the statistics that are highlighted by the government's own agency on numbers of children that are trafficked into the UK, not just for sexual exploitation purposes, but for all other forms of exploitation here. You talked about the possibility of children from Vietnam. It's a high proportion of children from Vietnam that are forced into this country, trafficked into the country, and forced to work in cannabis farm. So we're looking at children locked up in homes that have been converted into greenhouses, and their role is simply to cultivate the plants. UK is increasingly becoming a net exporter of cannabis. So again, it's something that you wouldn't think about. So no, I'm not shocked. It is obviously pleasing to note that the border agency has become a lot more vigilant, because I can give you an example of a 10-year-old girl that was brought into the country, trafficked into the country with a passport that gave her her age as 20, and she slipped through the nets of the border agency checks. It was 10 years later that we discovered, that the agencies discovered her and found that she was enslaved, not just forced to be a domestic servant in the home that she was captured in, locked up in, but also was sexually abused by both the husband and wife team. The latest hearing in the court, I believe, has awarded them £101,000 in compensation for the child. So again, there was 10 years of abuse taking place in Manchester, in a home in the UK. So certainly things are not working. Things are getting better, and I quite agree with Amanda, but I do believe that there are huge gaps in our enforcement of the protection that we have, and Bill talked about that even in a country like the UK, we do have large numbers of cases of abuse and exploitation of children as young as 6, 7, 10 years old.
Barty, I'm going to come back to the question of what the industry might do to help with this issue. I want first to establish the scale of the challenge. Before I go to Marcia, though, would you comment on the gap year problem? Now, these are children, well, they're hardly children anymore. They're young people, but often going abroad for the first time into environments where they're likely to be vulnerable. What do you see as the issues there and the scale of the issue?
Again, I think this is, we used to call it gap year, but I believe now it's called voluntary tourism, so it's kind of entered into the market of it being a tourism issue. What we have seen from the work that we've done, and I will look to Sally here, because I think we worked very closely with Sally in putting together our concerns and putting together codes of practices where young people, quite rightly, and it's something that most parents will encourage their young person to do, is to take some time out after their studies or midterm studies to go and experience the life out there. And it can be very, very beneficial. And it used to be done because, yes, you got so much more out of it. But as it's becoming extremely popular, and as there is a recognition that not only you get to get some experience of working abroad, but you get to have fun out there. And that fun is sometimes exploited. We've got we've heard of cases where individuals who are offenders in this country or are seeking out to abuse children in other countries are using this particular initiative, this particular popular idea of going abroad, working in orphanages out there. What it leads to often is the unintended consequences where orphanages or people have seen this as a way to make money. And so they would actively go out there and look for children so that they can place them in an orphanage. Often they are not orphans, so they would have been taken away from children. So there is a kind of unintended consequences, and if you like, the dark side to volunteerism. And we do very much need to be aware of how to address this. And one of the ways of addressing is making sure that those agencies that are advertising volunteerism as a way of getting people to travel abroad and experience life out there, to be very clear about what it is that the individual is looking at doing, to be very clear that there is a need out there. And so really making sure that if the person is volunteering to work with children, that adequate checks are made on the person that's leaving the country, and also making sure that that country benefits, and that particular orphanage or initiative in the destination country has a clear benefit from this, and it's not just used exploitatively.
Thanks, Bharti. Bill, I just want to come back to you for a second or two, because this is very close to the point that you were making about do no harm, isn't it? And you mentioned orphanages. There's clearly the issue of people going out to volunteer in orphanages, but we also have the other form of tourism practice of people visiting orphanages, maybe for a performance or to cuddle a child, with all the implications of that. Do you want to just comment on that before I go on to Marcia?
Well, it's hard to add anything to what's just been said. I mean, I would totally agree that, you know, orphanages, people believe that orphanages are the right place for children to be if they haven't got a family who look after them. But in actual fact, you know, 80 to 90% of the children in orphanages have actually got a living parent, if not both living parents. Often the parents have been sort of given an offer such as, you know, your child will receive an education, or we'll give you a little bit of money, and so on, in order for the child to be placed inside the orphanage. So they are in fact operating as businesses. And they create various opportunities for volunteers to come in of the kind you've described, to come in to see a performance, to come in for a couple of days to help out, to come in for a longer period, and so on. And, you know, there are several things happening there. One is we're creating an opportunity for abuse to happen by allowing unrestricted access to those children. The second thing is, for those children, they develop an attachment to somebody who comes in, particularly somebody who's in for a few days. They develop a short-term attachment. An attachment is extremely important for children. They need to feel attached to somebody. And, you know, someone comes in for a few days, the child is very clingy, very needy, in fact, because they've not got good attachment. And the volunteer feels great because this child is smiling and holding their hand and so on and so forth. But the volunteer is off in a few days, and the child feels a real sense of loss as a result. And that is quite traumatic for children, particularly younger children who experience that kind of a loss of attachment. So these are a variety of ways in which children, I think, can be quite damaged by mismanaged orphanage tourism. And in fact, I think generally we'd say it would be good to try and completely discourage orphan tourism. And, you know, there are other kinds of volunteerism that you can create that are much safer for children, and those are the kinds that we should be looking towards.
Thanks very much, Bill. Marcia, I said, you heard me say it in the green room, that I was very worried that we'd be pretending that the issues were all out there in the rest of the world and everything was okay in the UK. But from the way this discussion's gone so far, it seems to me we're focusing very much on the UK. Is this an issue that UNWTO sees around the world, or is it a UK issue?
Definitely, it's an issue that is around the world, everywhere. It's very difficult to imagine a country that in which you would not, if you look closely into, you would not find situations of that children would need some type of protection, or children are totally protected. Now, in the case of UNWTO, clearly, as the UN specialized agency for tourism, our focus is on situations related to tourism, to travel and tourism, especially the exploitation of children for labor or sexual exploitation. This said, I can see that there are situations that have been mentioned here before, that families travel and with children, and the children are neglected during their travel, or there are situations with children with the families that should not happen. But basically what our work has been done so far is in order to raise awareness of the situations of exploitation of children for labor or sexual purposes. And along the years, I think that we have evolved very much. We started on some 15 years ago on a more organized way in that regard, involving governments, the private sectors, NGOs. I think we have come a long way on that, but there's still very much to do. And experience shows that in not so much anymore, but in the beginning, there was from governments a first reaction in terms of, let's say, not accepting that those situations happened in their countries. So this is, we saw very frequently that the first reaction, oh no, this does not happen in my country. We don't see that anymore, or rarely we see that. So there is much more room to work with governments, with the private sector. The private sector is very, very much engaged. Both governments and the private sector have great interaction and support from NGOs. The NGOs have been key in that process to help raise awareness. And so in many different situations, we see that in terms of tourism-related situations, much has been done, much has been avoided, but the work is never complete.
Thanks very much for that, Marcio. Peter, can I turn to you? I remember being really shocked when somebody who worked for one of the big operators said to me, you know, we're having to tackle child abuse amongst our outbound customers. And when I asked those companies who we should get to come and talk about this, they said, talk to you. Could you tell us what your perspective is on that from the NSPCC, and what you know of what the industry's been doing to try and address those issues?
Yes, certainly. I think the first thing I would say is that there's a danger in any of these discussions that the focus is just on the abuse that takes place. You know, it's overseas, it's other people's problems. And actually our research at the NSPCC is really clear in terms of the level of abuse that takes place in the UK. And it's much more prevalent than we feel, any of us would feel comfortable about. And if you think about that, then the reality is that the families where abuse is taking place, and I agree with Bill, I think although we tend to think of abuse as being sexual abuse in these conversations, actually it is physical abuse, it's neglect and emotional neglect as well. If abuse is taking place in this country, then within families in this country, then we will take place when that family travels abroad. And so it is a problem which, when we travel abroad, we export in that sense. And therefore, a family where there is abuse is taking place in this country, it won't stop just because they've travelled abroad. And actually, if you think about the nature of going on holiday as well, to a certain extent, you let your guard down, you relax more, and maybe you take more risks than you otherwise would. So maybe as well, even if you are a family that is normally quite careful and safe in how you bring your children up, then actually maybe you take risks which you wouldn't otherwise take when you're in the UK that you would take when you're overseas. And the second thing I would say, before I get to Harold, before I get to what can be done, I think I would urge everybody in the room to view this problem not through how you perceive it, but actually how the world is perceived by children and young people. because for children and young people, they don't see adults in the way that we do. They see figures of authority, they see people who they can trust, and they're not very discriminating about that, because why would they be? And that's how grooming takes place. That's how children ultimately end up in abusive situations, because for them, when they see one of your tour operators, they see somebody who is somebody they trust. They trust by virtue of who they are, the person who befriends them on the holiday resort, the very friendly steward on the airplane, whoever it is. They just see that person as somebody they trust. They may only, from your perspective, have if almost fleeting contact and fleeting unsupervised contact with that child. But the nature of the contact that individual has had with that child is one where that child has seen an adult who they trust and therefore feel comfortable with. And for somebody who wants to exploit that, and that could be very well be one of your employees or somebody you contract with, that's where the real danger is as well, because that relationship can be exploited. In other words, the abuse doesn't have to take place at that first point of contact. It happens after that. It's when somebody builds on that, because they say, oh, do you remember me? I'm the person who you befriended. And I feel safe with you as a child. And the other thing is, when you think about older children, to young people, and again, just to say this absolutely is not something that doesn't happen in the UK. If you think back, those of you that would be familiar with the terrible abuse that took place in Rotherham that's been uncovered recently, where there was a report out recently that estimated there were 1,400, mostly young women, who were exploited horribly by gangs, and they were exploited sexually, and they were physically abused as well. And in that situation, the people who saw what was going on, authority figures in its broadest sense, and I'll come back to that in a second, they looked at those older, younger people and saw them as being a bit out of control, as making lifestyle choices, is how it was described. So somehow we end up in a bizarre world where you had 14-year-old girls who were making lifestyle choices to be gang raped. And yet, if you think about that in a holiday context, again, how many times have we been on holiday where we've seen some older children who perhaps have been engaging in activity which we just wouldn't tolerate in the UK, but actually, oh, well, they're on holiday. That's just what you do. And again, that I think is something to be absolutely aware of. I think in terms of what can be done, we've done some work with a number of organisations, Chewy being one, but where we have worked with them on making sure that they actually understand the world from a child's perspective and understand therefore where the risks actually are for children. And at its heart, what that's about is actually making sure that yes, you have the policies and the procedures in place, but also you have a culture that actually recognises that protecting children is everybody's responsibility, that children need to be listened to be believed, that when they're telling you something, and they may tell you non-verbally, not just verbally, that actually there's something going on that they're not comfortable about, or that you as an adult see and you are not comfortable about, that you know what to do about it, that your staff know what to do about it, they know who to report it to. And if abuse happens, I would very strongly argue that if a UK family takes their child on holiday overseas and you or your staff see something, then I think you and your staff have a responsibility to do something about that. And now that may be that you do something locally if it's so acute. There's a real problem, it needs to be dealt with now. Do your staff know who it is locally that they should contact because you're worried about that? Do they know? If they don't, they should. And it could equally be something which is not an acute problem that needs to be dealt with right now, but it's of sufficient cause of concern. You need to let somebody know, as you were saying you do at the borders. You need to let somebody, that family will go back to the UK. If you see something or your staff see something, I would question, does it stop being your responsibility at the point they leave your resort or your hotel or your premises? And I would strongly argue, if you or your staff have seen something, you could be the only people that have seen that, and you could be the only child, that child or children's only hope, in a sense, for getting help. And if I could bring it back to a UK context, just to finish, Harold, we're all horribly familiar now with the Savile story, where there was an individual who, over 5 decades, abused thousands of mostly females, not exclusively, and predominantly children. And everyone else asked the question, how did he get away with it? Well, the truth is he got away with it in the same way that most abusers get away with it. That first of all, he had a sense of an ability to build trust with individuals. His trust came from the fact he was very famous and iconic, and therefore was trusted because of that. But equally, as I said, trust could be because that's that friendly face behind the bar, the friendly family figure, the friendly. That's where the trust comes from. And then he abused that trust and abused those children. But the second thing was that children did speak out and did say that Savile was doing bad things to them. And people didn't either listen or didn't believe. And you can understand why that is, because I would say to you, how many of you have walked down the street and have seen somebody, an adult, who was being a little bit rough with a child that's made you feel uncomfortable? Could be a parent. And you kind of, what do I do? And it's a real dilemma, because you go over and intervene, do you say something? Of course you don't, because about what goes on inside your head, you say to yourself, actually, if I go and say something, will I make it worse? Will I become attacked in some sort of way? Am I actually misinterpreting what I'm seeing? And therefore the moment goes and you move on. And actually, if you look at Savile, if you look at almost every abuse case that you can mention, if you look at what happened in Rotherham, there were children and young people who were speaking up or who were seen to be in trouble by adults, and no one did anything. And the third thing I would say is that some research again from the UK that we've conducted, which I think is why at its heart I think that I would so strongly urge the tourism industry to up its game in this area even more than it has. We estimate that for every one child in the UK that is being hurt or abused, that is known to statutory authorities. In other words, for every child that's known to statutory authorities, police, children's social care and so on, there are 8 other children who are being hurt and abused who are not known to statutory authorities. Okay, so just think about that. So for every child that we know on that's been looked after in some shape or form by the statutory sector, that's been identified by the statutory sector, there are 8 others who are being hurt in some way or being abused in some way and are not known. The only way that we as a society, and that's not just tourism, that's society generally, can actually tackle that, is not to create armies and armies of more and more social workers, important and fantastic the work that they do is, or to double, triple or quadruple the number of border guards, although I'm sure you quite like that, or police. Actually, it requires all of us who are in figures or in positions of authority, be that because we're adults, be that because we employ staff in industries like tourism and others, to take some responsibility. And that means understanding the nature of abuse, understanding the nature of the abusive relationship, understanding our responsibility and that we do have a responsibility, understanding what we can do about it and what to do about it if we see something about it, and fundamentally recognizing that listening to, believing children, whether they're verbally telling us something or whether we're seeing something that they are from their behavior, that we should take that seriously. Because if you see it or your staff see it and you don't, then, in a sense, somebody else might not and somebody else might not. And for that child, for that young person, an opportunity has been lost to protect them at that point.
Peter, in what you've just said, which again, really pretty shocking, I think, but in what you've said, you frequently use that word responsibility. And I mean, that's obviously at the heart of what the Responsible Tourism Programme at WTM is about. And it seems to me that the issue is whether people convince themselves they didn't see it, don't take responsibility, ignore it, walk by on the other side. Which brings me, Elise, to you. Because the award we gave you last year was because you did something as a tourism company which is rare. You took an issue which you knew was there, and you said, we can't solve this problem as a tour operator. That we can't solve this without raising this issue with our travellers. And you went to the Dutch border police and you together ran a campaign raising awareness amongst travellers and encouraging them to report suspicious behaviour, which is a very unique thing in my experience for a tour operating business to do. How easy was it to do that?
It's not easy to create a national campaign and to have it launched in 3 Dutch airports, but it was the right timing. It was already in 2002, TUI Nederland was the first tour operator in the Netherlands to sign the code. Then it was still called the ECPAT code. We signed it with ECPAT Netherlands. And after quite some years, I had the feeling, doing all the steps in the code, okay, I've done this, the communication is right, the contract clauses are right, I want to do something more. On my wish list is to have a national campaign and to really run a project in one of our destinations. So first we had the big project in Brazil together with our big partners Plan, International Plan Netherlands, Plan Brazil, but also Ekpat Netherlands was involved. And we were trying to first focus on the supply side. How can you stop young women to enter the informal market? So we were focusing on the northeast of Brazil, where tourism is upcoming. We were not trying to get people out of the sex tourism industry. We were trying to give these young people who want to have a chance not to enter, to give them the tools that they don't have to enter, because we give them vocational training and we give them the tools how they should get a job. Many times in Brazil you can have all the education you want. There is a lot of free education available, but then they have a diploma and we gave them the tools and we tried to give them the way into the tourism industry, and that worked quite well. But that is the supply side, and then we also want to focus as TUI in the Netherlands on the demand side. How can you get your holiday makers that they are aware of the problem, and we didn't want to focus on them as that they are abusers, but that they are part of the solution. They are our eyes. They can see what's happening, and but when we were in this stage that we want to have a campaign, then we came across the border police. They just launched a campaign, but they didn't really truly involve the big tour operators. They did work together with the Tourism Association, but I thought they can do more. So I asked the border police, if you would like to do it again, please contact me and we will make it bigger. I have a big mouth, so Greet from the border police in the Netherlands, she contacted me. Yeah, I would like to do something more, and we started. And then the Ministry of Justice and Security, they wanted to join as well, and Plan became part of it, and Ekpat and the Tourism Association. I see Gerwin over there. They joined as well, and more people were joining this. This second campaign, instead of only one national campaign in Schiphol, the Amsterdam airport, we have it in 3 airports. And instead of only having it only now a second time, we have promised each other that we will do it for another 3 years. And we are now creating a new campaign again, and to do it all together. And what you can see now in this new campaign is more NGOs are joining. So it's Ekpat, Plan, it's Terre des Hommes, it's Free a Girl, and all these organizations focusing in the Netherlands on subjects like child protection. And instead of having all these separate small campaigns, we're all joining forces and one voice, so that a tour operator or the travel industry doesn't have to make a choice in which campaign to embrace and with whom we should work. But now we have one national campaign and we all follow.
Elise, there were 2 other things about this which struck me as being different from what I've seen elsewhere in terms of outbound. We'll come to inbound shortly, one of my promise. But in terms of outbound, you were deliberately educating tourists in general about what to look for, and educating them about then what to do, what number to call.
Yeah.
And that resulted in some prosecutions, I think.
Yeah, the first campaign, which was launched by the military police, was focusing on creating awareness, and not that many reactions came out, or reports came out of it, and they did a research, so that's why they knew. So the second campaign, we were really focusing, what should we ask the holiday makers to report? So we wanted to have better quality reports, not, oh, this guy, I saw this guy and he was wearing a trouser which was blue. Yeah, you cannot do anything with it. So we wrote down this, I don't have it, a small leaflet with on the back what they should look out for, and this really worked. And in 6 months' time, we had 27 reports. It doesn't sound like a lot, but it was way more than what normally comes in. And out of these 27 reports, there were 5 good leads, 2 international ones and 3 Dutch leads, and that's really a success in 6 months' time.
Now, the second bit of this I don't understand is that I've seen one report in the Evening Standard of a London hotel where, because the staff had been trained in child protection, they actually reported it, and a child trafficking gang was arrested, prosecuted, and imprisoned. And that hotel worked really hard to make sure that it didn't get mentioned in the press releases. They didn't want to take the credit for the extraordinary contribution which their own staff had made to the catching of a child trafficking ring. I don't know, did Peter, do you, or Bill, do you understand this?
Well, I think at its heart, again, there needs to be, the sea change that needs to happen here is that at the moment many organisations, and I suspect that many of us in the room have been worked in and maybe still doing organisations where if something like that happens and you go into crisis management mode, what do we do? Your first thinking is actually you need to protect the reputation of the organisation, and therefore the response that you just described, it feels like the right response. I would suggest to you that I mean, personally, I think that the response should be what's in the best interest of children, and therefore making that decision.
Sure.
But actually, I think we're moving into an era, thank goodness, where because of forums like this, but because actually people are talking about abuse more often, that actually in order to protect your reputation, that's a completely unsustainable position, and your reputation would be worse off if it looks like in any shape or form the first decision you took was to protect your organisation, rather than to protect children on the back of what you just discovered. That actually it is not only is it better for children, but it's better for your reputations and therefore you commercially to make a decision which is actually, as you described, to be front foot and say, actually, we took the right decisions for children. And I think that you will, that over time, we're in an era now where I think you will get both reputational and commercial credit for that. And conversely, if you are in any shape or form seen to be covering things up in any way at all, and even if that's not what you meant to do, if you are seen to be covering up in some shape or form, you will suffer commercially and reputationally as a result.
Thanks, Peter. Willem, you've been really patient. Can I ask you how you see the challenge from the perspective of an inbound operator in a part of the world where it's assumed that this is more common than it is in Europe? I'm not so sure that that's true, but nonetheless, that is a common assumption. How does it look from where you are in Southeast Asia?
Yeah, that's correct. Actually, it's everywhere in the world. It's not necessarily linked to Asia, but obviously Asia is a major destination for a lot of travelers. In many cases, travelers come to our region for the first time on a long haul. That is a bit of a culture shock right there. We've been working very closely together with Project Childhood Pillar, and they did a survey in the last 2 years that showed that just less than 20% of the passengers felt that they had enough information on child protection when they came to our destinations. And at the same token, 80% of them wanted to have more information. And that survey was actually taken by a TUI, most of the passengers were TUI related, so they were Intrepid passengers and a number of our travelers as well, and these travelers could be seen as actually quite educated on this particular subject, and yet they felt they didn't have enough information and they wanted to have much more information. So knowing that, we felt the first step to take is to make sure that our arriving passengers had information that was relevant to what they would see around them. And that might be different than information that they would get generalized, what we have before, which is very important, like what to do if you see child abuse. And they would generally know that. Well, we would put information in there with local telephone numbers, because obviously in every country it's a different helpline, so it helps to have the correct telephone number if you're in the correct country, things like that. But a more pressing point was a lot of our travelers that we saw wanted to contribute to solving the problem, actively, proactively contribute to solve the problem. So that's a little bit different than to act on when you see something going wrong. They wanted to actually see where can contribute to make sure that it doesn't happen at all? In other words, where can we contribute to make sure that children are not at risk anymore? And that was a good point that was made before as well. The problem, the moment that there is child abuse already, it is usually because children have first been at risk. It is first in period that they are at risk. And that in many of the countries that we see, one of the main areas where you can see that as a tourist is children begging or children selling souvenirs. That in effect, begging and selling souvenirs is bad enough as it is, and it is one of the child abuses as it is already, but it's usually the first step, and before it gets even worse into sexual exploitation. So what to do for children at risk there? So we have been talking a lot about what to do as a tour operator, because we are not an NGO, we are a business at the same time, and I think that is very powerful because as a business you can really do a lot. And when you start a conversation, you seeking solutions that you can include your clients in, and we looked at a lot of things what we can do in the day-to-day operations and in itineraries actually that we can do for clients. And one of the things is what we could do more is work together with NGOs like social enterprises that take in street children, was a little bit what we heard before, take in street children and make sure they get a vocational training apart from just education and get a diploma, but also get vocational training, get trained up to in hotel or restaurant business. And it brings me on another point, that is travel industry, especially in the countries that we are in, is a massively growing industry. If you look, for example, at a country like Cambodia, that came out of pure poverty in the early 90s and had absolutely nothing, no hotels, nothing, and right now receives somewhere in the region of about 6-7 million tourists a year. So that is a massive growth of tourism, and growth of tourism is opportunity to make money. And in Asia that means making money for the family. It is a family, usually family working together. It is not as in Europe where children go to school, get an education and hopefully get a job, and that's it. In Asia it's much more a family business, so children help in restaurants as well, but it's another problem what you can see. People think, oh, children are in restaurants, they're working, and usually they're helping the family after school, which is not necessarily a bad thing in Asia. But on the other hand, it can go wrong from there, because if money is being made, then a family in Asia usually can often take the opportunity to say, well, this is good for us, we make money out of sending our children out to sell garlands at traffic lights or something like that, because they can bring in $5 a day. $5 a day, if another child brings another $5 a day, and it all adds up, and before you know it, you have a family income. So something needs to be done about that, and that is where really where our clients can really contribute. Go to the right restaurants, take the right shops where actually you can buy things that are made by in an ethical way, in the right way, but by local families or local communities, but in an ethical way. You can buy there, you know for sure that your money goes to the right causes. So you can really actively contribute. So I think for us there's a lot that we can do, and we have just started it. There's still a lot to do. The next step that we are going to do is actually trying to go back to our clients, which in our case are tour operators in the Western world for most part, and see how they can contribute to put these things actually already in programs, so that we, the clients, when they are really travelers themselves, are really actively contributing to solving this problem.
Thanks very much, Willem. I'm going to come back to the panel in a minute or towards the end and ask each of you to identify one or two things you think the industry could do that would make a really big difference. But before we do that, there's an audience here which has been incredibly attentive. I can't believe there aren't some questions. There's a lady here. Someone got a microphone, please? The lady here, and then Sally. Ah, there's only one microphone. We'll get it back for you, Marcio, at some point. The lady here, the lady with the specs. No, that's it. And then we'll come to you, Sally.
Hello. My question is more towards in terms of, because I travel around in West Africa quite a lot, and I work in the arts field quite a lot. And what I've tended to see, and when I've been talking to people, we've been discussing this issue because we can see this issue, and I write about it in terms of human rights and literature and stuff as well, is that, yes, there's this, when visitors are going into these countries, exploiting children, we know that that is the issue, and yes, the travel trade should be able to help more with the tour operators in that, but the other main problem is just the basic issue of poverty, because at the end of the day, even though some of these internally, people like ECPAT will be working with organizations in some of these countries, and these people are doing training with everybody who's involved with the child and in the industry, in the hotels, the taxi drivers and everything. These people are all poor. So when a tourist comes and wants to offer more money, even though these people know it's wrong, they're still going to take it because they have families to feed. So, and that on an individual basis, an underlying issue is a really big issue. And that's something I'm sitting here listening to what everybody's saying is amazing and wonderful. You can see how much work is being done there, but it's like, how do you get to that very basic level, that poverty issue?
Can we ask Barty perhaps to respond to that first on the rights and poverty issue and the way those two things so often conflict?
I'm so glad that you've raised the issue of the rights, because I think the discourse in this room has been about the responsibilities, and what we've heard from many organizations is they are being responsible. They are making people aware of what not to do, and particularly around the exploitation of children, but it does go on, as you said quite rightly. So we need to change. I think I'm going to drop this one. Can I use it this way? That's better. It's quite uncomfortable behind here. We need to change the discourse here, and we really need to start thinking about the vulnerability of certain groups of communities and certain groups of people across the world, and the heightened vulnerabilities as a result of that lack of sheer opportunity to escape the kind of poverty that you're talking about. And unless we understand that vulnerability and the causes of those vulnerability and begin to tackle it, no amount of responsible tourism could address that. It will pick at it, it will try and make dents at it. But I think what we need to do, therefore, I'd like to change the motion a little bit, which would say not just the responsibility for child protection, but the responsibility to inform the child of their rights. To ensure that the governments of the countries that we're talking about, that includes the UK government, who certainly, from the news that we have of child exploitation in this country, in failing its responsibility and its duty to protect children. So I think if you look at things like the Article 4 of the UNCRC, and Howard, do allow me a little bit of space here, which clearly talks about the responsibility of governments to take all available measures to make sure children's rights are respected, protected, and fulfilled. And we're talking about social and welfare services, legal, health, and educational systems, as well as the kind of funding that should be made available to provide this very basic fund. And I don't know what responsibility all of us can take to ensure that every government in every country makes children's rights as an absolute priority.
I'm sure everybody in the room agrees about children's rights, but there's very little that we as an industry can do to get governments to respond to that.
I think you'd be surprised, Howard, how much, because I think if industries could join NGOs that are lobbying for those and for adequate measures, industries lobby governments for changes to ensure that they've got investment in those countries so that they can send tourists out. Industries are brilliant lobbyists. Join us in our lobby.
Okay. I'd like to bring us back to what the tourism industry can do, though. Sally, do you have a question? Could you make it a question? Or
it will be a question. I can't promise it's a question. I work in an area of the travel industry which child protection is very important. We run a volunteer recruitment organisation. I was talking to someone today and I was like, we don't place, and we've lobbied to stop volunteer travel to orphanages. I was talking to someone today who genuinely believes he's doing good by sending volunteers to orphanages, and asked me the question, what should I do if I remove our support? What should I do as transitional support to support those orphanages? He genuinely believes he only works with good orphanages. And when we worked with Responsible Travel and ECPAT for the code for working in orphanages, it was something we have to address. Many orphanages are receiving skilled, well-briefed, well-prepared volunteers. What would your answer be, you childcare experts, we have a responsibility, do we not? We can't just say, we're going to stop.
Thanks, Sally. Just hold on to that question. I'm going to gather 3 or 4 because we're going to run out of time otherwise. So hang on to that question, we'll come back to it. Could you bring it to the lady here, please? If you could give us your question, that would be great.
Yeah, can I just explain? I've worked for 23 years in Brazil with street children for an NGO called Happy Child International. And we ran a campaign called It's a Penalty with the run-up to the World Cup, raising awareness against child sexual exploitation here in this country with Jubilee Campaign and Action International and the National Crime Agency and Europol and the Metropolitan Police. And we raised messages through our, I'm going to get there, just need to say, our ambassadors like Gary Lineker and David Luiz and Oscar and Ramirez. And the messages were put out through, we recorded a film and British Airways showed it on all their international flights. And the National Crime Agency said there were no UK arrests. And we work with the FA, the Football Association, ECPAT, UNICEF in Brazil. And so people were told on flights, they were handed wristbands at the UK airports, and they were said, you can be part of the solution by dialing 100. It would be lovely to talk to you afterwards, actually, because we want to run the same thing.
Elise, we'll get you to answer that question, because clearly there is something that you did that made it work. Is that the question, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think, how can the world travel market help? I really think, I mean, British Airways was one airline, but I mean, if all airlines can come, and I know some other airlines also raise awareness, but I think the way that world travel market could help is actually encourage other airlines to also communicate.
Look, we'll definitely come back to that question. There's a gentleman here who's wanting to ask a question as well.
Thanks. Thank you, Howard. I mean, this is a wonderful afternoon, but those of us who have been in the industry for a long time, founder members of the Society for Responsible Tourism 30 years ago, the key element when that was set up was about child prostitution right around the world. The world hasn't really changed in that. My question to the panel is, how do we get, and I think in terms of the industry, we need to get the people who write about tourism to start talking about this as an issue. I am fed up reading articles in the Saturday papers that tell me about all the wonders, and we won't name the countries concerned, but we all know who they are, that tell me all about the wonders of those countries, but who never, ever mention the fact that the governments of those countries are turning a blind eye to what is happening to children in the streets. And we need to start putting pressure on travel writers. Even if it's the last paragraph, they can wax about the wonders of the particular place concerned, but in the last paragraph we need, because then the people who actually spend the money in these countries will start to vote with their feet and will start avoiding the places that aren't taking this seriously.
Can we come to Martin here as well for the last question?
What is interesting about the discussion is that you've not actually talked about some ways in which demand will adapt to the extra pressure that's been brought about by the excellent work that's obviously been taking place. So I was talking with Marina beforehand about this, is that of course people are, as it's been suggested, very secretive, and so they can now make bookings online on an aeroplane. They don't have to come across the tourism industry directly at all. They can even book girls, you know, online before they arrive. So they don't even have to ask anybody. And as Marina pointed out, they even, if they want to, they can have video cams and never travel at all. You know, so I mean, it is a pretty awful situation. So it does seem to me that Elise, and your approach there is a very interesting one, because it is actually providing information clearly which will help people to at airports. If they're going to travel, they're going to have to go to an airport. And therefore to communicate there and at arrival as well is going to help deal with the demand. Now the other question is actually about data. You talked about some data, about the 1 and the 8 who are not, but how many abusers are there? We've got people going through Heathrow Airport. How many go in a month? 4 million in a month? I don't know how many go through in a month, of which you've got 500 who were stopped and 100 of which needed some. So it's trying to understand the abusers, as it were. And we assume automatically they're all men, but actually, I would guess, there are quite a lot of women involved in this as well. So I'd like to get the data on the demand side, and I'm not sure we've got that. I know they're secretive, but I'm sure more could be done to get at it. And I would like, you know, to suggest that that's one of the things that we do.
I think, Martin, that was very close to a suggestion that we come back to this issue next year, which is, I'm grateful to you for that. Okay, we have 4 questions on the floor. One from Sally, which was about how you help someone in the transition if you withdraw the volunteers. A question here about whether more airlines might take up this as a campaigning issue, but there is then the question of how successful is this in terms of actually getting people to call it in. We have the point about pressure on governments and travel writers providing some of that pressure by talking about the child protection issues, and we have the questions that Martin just raised about data and the very real danger, although I don't think it's a reason not to do it, that by dealing with the issue in one place you merely displace it to another. What I'd like to do is, with those 4 questions in mind, because we are rapidly approaching 5 o'clock, I can't believe that we're running out of time, but we are, I'd like to go back round the panel, if I may, and ask each of you to comment on whichever of those questions you would like to answer, and I'm sure by the end we will have an answer to all of them. Could I start with you?
Yes. Well, it definitely is a dilemma. You're absolutely right about it. It's a question that we often get asked about. You know, we want to change the situation, but actually, if we do change the situation suddenly, that will probably create as many problems as it will leaving the situation as it is. So that's, and it's, for example, an issue in child labour where people often say, can we just not abolish child labour? Well, actually, if you do, you often end up with children in much worse situations than they were before. So I think this is another example of that. Just pick up on one thing that you mentioned was that, you know, somebody saying, well, I'm sure the orphanages that we work with are fine. Actually, I think that's a very dangerous thing to think, because there's lots of experience from, for example, from Nepal, where on the surface, everything looks wonderful. You know, you go and visit, the children look as if they're well cared for and fed and so on. What you can't see is the violence and the abuse they experience behind the scenes, and the quality of care they're getting, and the separation from their families. So, you know, I think it's extremely difficult to be sure that a good orphanage is in fact a good orphanage and so on. So that's just a sort of, I suppose, a warning there. Most children in orphanages, as I say, have got families. So clearly and they ought to be back in their families. That's where they belong, and that's where they would probably be safest, and so on. So a lot of the work that we're doing is currently trying to reintegrate children back into their families, and other NGOs do a similar thing, which is to support the return of children into their own families and their own communities where they actually belong and will get the best care and protection that they deserve. I think in terms of, I mean, volunteering, it's how can we actually not, in a sense, end volunteering, but how can we improve the model so that in fact it delivers better for communities, for the adults who are caring for the children. So I suppose it's trying to redirect that volunteering impulse and the desire to do good into a more productive and a safer kind of outcome. And that again, I think is something that could be done in the transition period, to enable, in a sense, orphanages to continue perhaps to benefit from improved conditions in the orphanage, but not by providing opportunities for unsupervised access to children. But you're right about that dilemma, so I absolutely agree with you.
Willem.
Yeah, about destinations having to take more responsibility, and travel writers have to take more responsibility for not just waxing about how beautiful the countries are, and they are. Child abuse is everywhere, every country, and I think we have plenty of examples that currently the UK is one of them. It's not only in exotic destinations that this problem is. That being said, as I said before, I think travel writers, I agree, have more responsibility to write also about what can we do to make sure that children get an education and children get an opportunity to work, and children get protected on that. And travelers need to know about that. They don't need to know only about the beautiful forests and beautiful temples and all that, but also what they can do. And as the survey actually said that we were part of, is that the travelers actually want to get this information. That's the interesting thing. So you said, well, travel writers don't write about it, and it's not very clever, because actually travelers want to know how can we contribute. So yes, I do agree, a lot can be done, but it is not only in exotic countries, it's in all countries. It's not just in Brazil or in Cambodia, it is in the UK, it's everywhere. So that could also go for inter-European travel, for travel in general. And airlines would be a great place to do that as well. How can we contribute to prevent child abuse and make sure that children get a proper youth, a proper education on the standard that is relevant in their country. And there must be a lot of education on the differences between the West and going to developing countries, because what you see is completely different. And again, the culture shock, and it's a bit of an old-fashioned word, but it's still very much there for a lot of people coming to a Western country or to Latin American country. It is very much far removed from what they are used to in their own countries, and therefore getting confused. What is child abuse? What seems to be normal, which is another thing. What seems to be normal, sometimes it is normal, and sometimes it isn't. So there's a lot of education that needs to be done. Totally agree. Travel writers need to do a lot more on that.
Thanks, Willem. Peter, could we come to your concluding thoughts?
Yeah, yeah, certainly. Just a quick plug for stats. If you want some starting point for stats and UK-based stats, if you go to the NSPCC's website and just type in prevalence study, you get our most recent, most comprehensive report on what we think is the extent of all forms of abuse in the UK, and it's worth a look. I suppose a couple of concluding thoughts. I think the first one is that it's the 1 in 8 thing stat again I used before, and that's that in terms of why I think the tourism industry is so important in this, as are other industries, is that the reality is that the statutory sector in this country, and indeed the rest of the world, on their own will not be able to protect children in the way that we in this room would want to happen. And the reality is that your staff, your contractors are eyes and ears that will see things, and we should get to a point where that you and your staff feel that they understand what to do if they see something, that they don't need to be certain about something. If they suspect something, that they know what to do with that suspicion, and feel confident and comfortable about doing it, and actually that you have an expectation that they will do that. And that requires, yes, policies and procedures. It definitely requires a culture change. And I think we're moving into an era where, far from being something which is an added extra, I think increasingly it's going to be seen as a commercial imperative for many of you to be doing that, and be seen to be doing it, because quite frankly, families will get to the point that they're not going to use companies, airlines, and providers unless they feel that their children are as safe with you as they would be when they go to the local school or the local youth club in this country. And my final point, Harold, is this. It's very interesting, again, just with the UK perspective. If you go back 5 years, 10 years, and you did a survey of the UK population, what they would say to you was that they would estimate the level of abuse in this country, and I'm talking about all forms of abuse, as Bill said at the beginning. It isn't just sexual abuse, it's physical abuse, it's emotional abuse, and it's neglect, all of which damage childhoods and ultimately damage life chances and life expectations for, sadly, thousands. Then actually they would underestimate it, and indeed not would they underestimate it, they would actually kind of say, and actually I don't really want to hear about it, I don't want to talk about it. We've now got to a situation in the UK, and I would suspect it's not just in the UK, where people say, actually, to be honest, I know it's going on. I know it's going on more than I'm comfortable about, and actually, I don't want to talk about it because actually I don't feel comfortable about it because I don't think there's anything we can do about it. In other words, we've gone from I don't believe it's really as much, it's happening as much as you say, to actually I do believe you, but I don't think there's anything you can do about it because it's always going to happen. My plea, and that fatalism is almost more dangerous than actually not believing it's happening in the first place, because that creates that. And all I would say to you in the industry is please don't put yourself in that fatalistic position, that there are really innovative and creative ways that you can help. That's by the sorts of campaigns that Elise was talking about, which is about supporting your customers to be the eyes and ears, for your staff to be the eyes and the ears. And I think, as I say, in the longer term, I think that not only will children be better protected, but I think you'll be commercially more successful as a result.
Thanks, Peter. Elise.
First to answer the issue of webcam sex tourism. This year, Terre des Hommes in the Netherlands they created a fake child in the Philippines called Sweetie. And Sweetie was able to attract pedophiles, many. And they handed the whole profile, they handed it over to the police. I think in this report you can find data on this streaming sex tourism, which is in many countries still legal, because downloading is illegal, but national governments are changing these laws now as well. About the Brazil issue, what I heard is that during the World Cup, many companies NGOs were focusing on please phone or dial 100, and then instead of only having a Portuguese-speaking person, there was actually somebody employed for all the other languages, an English-speaking person. And what I heard is that quite some people phoned the number. I don't know how many offenders from the UK were there, but there are researches that it worked. It was not spectacular, but it worked. And then what I would like to do, what I think what is needed now for tour operators like TUI is, instead of only having the child protection code, I would like to go further and to explore if we can embrace the child rights and business principles, where we take a look at the children more in a broader sense. The child rights and business principles are set up by Save the Children, UN Global Compact and UNICEF. And I think that's a step forward, that we will better integrate the rights of children, all children, into our process and procedures. For instance, one of the things they also ask you to look at is how do we deal with your communication? If you have a communication protocol, and how you will put children into a brochure. These things.
Thank you. That was almost set up for you, Bertie.
It certainly was. I think very interesting on the data and the statistics. It is something that's going to be most difficult thing to try and do, but there are some data, and there is an element of a lack of complacency on how to act on the data that we've available. 65,000.
Can I just ask?
Yeah.
I think you and I should make a commitment that we will put this data on the World Travel Market
Brilliant.
website alongside the report of this event. We can definitely do that. I'm sure Save the Children and NSPCC.
Yeah, and there is also a gap in reporting cases of abuse, so that again creates a bit of a problem on collecting the data. In the UK, CEOP has a website where people can report it, but my colleague who's sitting here recently experimented on the website to see whether she could report a case, and it stopped her going further than the first few pages. So CEOP are now forced to look at their reporting site, and we're hoping that data collection is going to be ECPAT International itself, yesterday in these very building, announced a study of sexual exploitation of children, a global study of sexual exploitation of children, and UNWTO will be sitting on the task force. And the idea is to examine the new changing faces of tourism and sexual exploitation of children, which will also look at the online exploitation, the gaps in current protection legislation, the gaps in implementation of the international instruments to protect children. So we're hoping that next year, Harold, we will be able to provide a little bit more understanding of what the situation is looking like across the globe, and where are the gaps, and who has the responsibility, if you like, to ensure that the rights of the children are protected and the children are made aware of what those rights are and a bit more empowered than they are at the moment.
Thanks very much, Bharti. I should probably also say that I committed me, to run a workshop in the UK for tour operators for that same study sometime early in January. Amanda, I'm not sure if you want to comment on the questions, but please do. But could you also maybe say what the industry could do to help you with your task at Heathrow?
Working. Hello? Yes, it's working. Our Director General of Border Force describes Border Force as a single unique intervention point. But I think really when it comes down to it, we all have that possibility to intervene. We've done some work with airlines and travel industries to highlight trafficking. And obviously we'd encourage the travel industry to do more around that, and also airlines, because while we're that intervention point, we have limited time to make that interaction, to make the questions. We will go as far as we can. But if somebody has come on a flight of 8 hours, there's an awful lot more warning indicators that somebody could be looking for. If somebody's on holiday, there's an awful lot more indicators that people can report. So I think, you know, that's what I would encourage for everybody really, to take forward and be that intervention point, and not to turn a blind eye to anything. One of the recent cases I had with one of my officers, she'd held up an American lady with 2 beautiful children, and she was coming here to visit her boyfriend. And I walked through, as I was walking through, I normally see whatever cases are going on at the time, and I asked the officer, why have you held them up? Because I'm always conscious of, you know, also time, how long we're holding families. We've got pressures on ourselves to do that. And she said, she spoke to the boyfriend and she said, he was too nice. And I knew, because the expertise, you know, the staff are really committed, you know, they're absolutely go to the nth degree. And there was a hunch, there was an instinct that she did something about. And it turned out he was actually already on police bail for abusing his stepdaughter previously. Yes, so that's, you know, and he'd groomed this lady from the States with the children, and so that was it. She didn't do it because he was too nice. So there was just some gut instinct, and I'm sure we all have that instinct, and we mustn't turn a blind eye, I think, whoever we are.
Marcia, can we come finally to you? I mean, It's great that you're here as part of this. It's part of our partnership around World Responsible Tourism Day. Is this something where we can continue to work with you and move this agenda forward?
Definitely, Harold. What I would like to say is that since in 1997 we formed the Task Force for the Protection of Children in Tourism, with governments and marvelous partners such as ECPAT and private companies. Much has been done, much has been understood. I think that the level of discussions that we've seen here today is very, very much different from what we would have seen 3 or 5 years ago. We know much more. We have been able to collect more than 100 cases, good practices from the industry, from NGOs. We published just a few of them, 16 of them this year, but there are many things that in our sector we have learned. So this dissemination of good practices, the understanding of the problems, what the private sector can do, big companies, big operators, airlines, they can do in order to fight against the problem, to reduce and to eliminate situations of child exploitation in tourism and in other situations is at hand. Of course, the task is huge. UNWTO is continuing engaged with its engagement. Lately, we have started, based on our Global Code of Ethics in tourism, to get the engagement, direct engagement of the private sector and the private sector associations. Now we have in more than 50 countries, over close to 400 businesses that have committed themselves to the principles of the Global Code of Ethics. They have to report to us. We report to the UN General Assembly. There is much more at hand. There is much more that we can do. Not only the case of British Airways, but the case of British Airways can be also applied to other companies. I know that other airlines have done in different situations in Brazil, as you mentioned, Brazil, TAM Airlines in Brazil have done it. So we can do much more. There's a lot to be done, but now we are in a much better position because people rarely refuse there is a problem, to accept there is a problem, and there are much more people and companies, NGOs and governments ready to engage, besides those that are already engaged.
Well, Marcio, we will be coming back to you to continue with this, because I'd like to see us addressing this issue again in Brazil and in Africa in due course at the responsible tourism programs there. It's one indicator that I was fearful we might only get a few people for this debate this afternoon. We've got about 3 times the number of people that we had last year when we discussed child protection. That is a step forward and one of the indicators that things are improving. 2 other things to say, because I broke my own rules. We're supposed to finish on time, and my goodness, I'm nearly 15 minutes over time. The networking reception is in Platinum 1. If you do want to talk with our speakers, I hope all of them are going to join us for the networking in Platinum 1. And the second thing to say is that many of our speakers today actually travelled a long way to be here. They've come specially. Some from central London, at least one from Amsterdam. Rotterdam, sorry. And I'm very grateful to you. And I'm grateful too that you came. I'm glad you wore your uniform. And I'm sorry we couldn't find you anywhere better to change other than the ladies. But it's good to have you here in your uniform. So if I could ask you to thank the panel and then go and enjoy the reception.